Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time we're on a week 69. Nice. The Forgotten Front. World War I in Libya. We're going to a new front for this week at least. Let's see if anything exciting is happening in Libya. But before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Okay, let's just go ahead and dive right in.
I said the other week that there were now 12 war zones in this war. 12 on 3 continents. But you know what? That's obviously not enough because this week, yet another war zone opens.
Woo! War!
I'm Indian.
Dead bodies! Woo! Post-traumatic stress disorder! Woo! Shell shock! Woo! More war! Yay.
Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Italians had begun the 4th Battle of the Isonzo River against Austria-Hungary. The Russians had again stopped the Germans in the northeast. The Germans and Austrians were rampaging through Serbia, while the Bulgarians had their hands full trying to stop the French from reaching the Serbs and uniting forces. Here's what came next on the world's battlefields. Let's take a look first at the Italian front, where the 4th Battle of the Isonzo River was raging. Now, because of the early arrival of winter, Italian Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna's objectives were somewhat limited. There was heavy snow in the north, so there was no hope of gaining control of the Bovec Basin or destroying the Austrian bridgehead at Tolmin. So following short but incredibly intense artillery barrages, wave after wave of Italian infantry went up the exposed slopes of Hill 383, Mount Sabatino, Mount San Michele, Oslava, and Podgora. The Austrian machine gun emplacements took a heavy toll on the brave but freezing and exhausted Italian soldiers. So Cadorna, like he had done before, was throwing away the huge advantage he had in men, which was more than 2-1. Now, all the attacks on Hill 383 were repulsed, but the attacks south of Zagora followed what was by now becoming a familiar pattern. The Italians would advance and push back the enemy until Austrian reserves arrived and held the line. The Italian Third Army was commanded by Prince Emanuele Filberto, the Duke of Aosta, cousin to King Victor Emmanuel III. This army had the nickname Armata Invita, undefeated army. But, at least here, that may have been a misnomer, for his army made repeated desperate attacks up the slopes of Mount Saint Michel.
Genius plan. Genius plan.
Which either failed or made tiny gains that were retaken by Austrian counterattacks. In its second week, the intensity of the battle was growing, and the casualties were climbing as high as they had in the 3rd Battle of the Isonzo last month. And another battle, not too far away, was also growing in intensity this week. The French had tried and tried to reach the Serbs last week, battling the Bulgarians up Mount Archangel until Bulgarian reinforcements arrived and the French advance was stopped. Now the Bulgarians took the offensive. Their intention was to circle around the French, cut off their retreat by destroying the only means of crossing the Cherna River, a wooden bridge, and pin them up against the mountains. Violent battle took place over 3 days between the French and the Bulgarians, and at the end of the 3rd day, the Bulgarian lines broke and they were routed. The fighting over those 3 days had been a really near thing, though. Several times, the Bulgarian infantry had got to within a dozen meters of the French, but couldn't push past the French machine guns. However, though in the end, the Bulgarians were forced to retreat, the French didn't have enough men to pursue them and press their advantage, push their way to the Babuna Pass, and relieve the Serbian forces. Those Serbs held out till November 15th, hearing the French guns so close, loud and clear, but the French could not do the impossible. And French General Sarrail did not dare to leave that tiny bridge over the Cherna, that single, slender line of retreat too far behind. The Bulgarians had only been defeated, not crushed. The Serbs finally fell.
I mean, it makes sense why he doesn't want to really abandon or get too far away from that bridge because, you know, that's his one way of retreat. And it's very narrow. It would take forever to retreat across it too. I mean, because it would take so long to retreat across it, I feel like the moment you cross that thing, you gotta go full send and just keep going, because that thing ain't gonna allow you to retreat. That tiny bridge, Now, you'll be shot at or whatever if you're being pursued on your heels by the Bulgarians. So it's like,
back from the pass, and the French, not knowing this, held Mount Archangel till the end of the week, when the Bulgarians returned to fight them again. But the situation of the Serbian army was now desperate.
oh no.
The Austrian, German, and Bulgarian lines began at Visegrad, north of Montenegro, and went across Serbia in a straight line towards Niš, curved down to Vranja, then to Velez, and then down to where the French army stopped it from reaching the Greek border. It was a dragnet, and if it was contracted, the Serbian forces would be swept towards the Albanian and Montenegrin mountains, which could not be passed by any organized force, and only the hardiest of souls in any case. The last chance of breaking this dragnet was the French breaking through. But once the Serbs...
But the French don't have enough troops to really end this. What? The French came with 20,000? There's 400,000 Germans and Austro-Hungarians? And Bulgarians?
withdrew from Babuna Pass, that was it. It was indeed a dire and disheartening situation for the Serbs. And one other disheartening situation for the Allies was at Gallipoli. On November 11th, British Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener had traveled to Gallipoli to see the dismal situation there firsthand, and it was dismal. As we've seen, the demoralized British and Anzac troops had no real hopes left for any kind of a victory, were short on artillery shells, were riddled with disease, and had insufficient shelter and equipment for the winter that was about to begin. Kitchener's generals had urged evacuation, but Kitchener had refused, worrying that admitting defeat would have a negative effect on the Muslim subjects of the British Empire. After seeing the situation firsthand, he now changed his tune and called for a speedy evacuation. And a side note here, Winston Churchill, one of the main architects of Gallipoli, who had still been arguing that it could be won, now basically gave up and went to the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel to command a battalion there. The Bulgarian front, Salonika, the Italian front, Gallipoli, these were all relatively new fronts that had opened up in the past 6 months or so. This week, yet another war zone would open. On November 14th, what is probably the most forgotten front of the entire war opened, the Libyan front.
Woo!
Libya was Italian, but before 1912 had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and now the Senussi tribesmen rose up against the Entente with support from the Turks. The Senussi attacked a British-Egyptian border post and would continue harassing attacks. Each time the British army would go into action against them, the tribesmen would melt into the desert. British officer Captain Jarvis, stationed in Egypt, had this to say: "In some respects, this was the most successful strategic move made by our enemies of the whole war. For these Arabs, tied up on the western frontier for over a year, some 30,000 troops badly required elsewhere."
Nice.
And here's a small note from one of the
Well, isn't Africa holding up more, though? Just saying.
elsewhere those troops could not go to, the Western Front. On November 17th, the French Army Committee of the Senate insists on the future use of asphyxiating gas. Yes, the French will join the Germans and the British in gassing each other on the Western Front.
Woo.
Now, to be fair, it was the French that used gas the first of them all at the very beginning of the war. But that was tear gas, not chlorine, phosgene, or any other new and deadly form of poison. And at the end of the week,
Of course.
Britain sends submarines to support the Russian fleet in the Baltic. And it was indeed a busy week, with the Italians bravely trying again and again versus Austria as the winter came on. The French routing the Bulgarians but unable to press them further, as the Serbs are forced into a dragnet that's about to close. A decision made to finally evacuate troops at Gallipoli and the opening of the Libyan front in North Africa. It was quiet on the Western Front this week, which isn't surprising after the 6 weeks of carnage that had just recently ended and caused hundreds of thousands of casualties. But I'm going to end with something from that front, a quote from Louis Bartha's Poilu that shows life on the quiet front. In certain places, the trenches had completely disappeared underwater. Almost all of the dugouts had collapsed. Our section was lucky enough to have a dugout which was still intact. But one night, when the rain came down in torrents, the tide invaded our dugout. The next day, at many places on the front line, the soldiers had to come out of their trenches so as not to drown. The Germans had to do the same. We therefore had the singular spectacle of two enemy armies facing each other without firing a shot. Frenchmen and Germans looked at each other and saw that they were all men, no different from one another. They smiled.
Oh, we are having
we
another
shared
wholesome
tobacco.
moment.
A huge devil of a German stood up on a mound and gave a speech which only the Germans could understand, but everyone knew what it meant because he smashed his rifle on a tree stump.
Oh, I've heard this story.
Applause broke out on both sides. If only you had been there, mad kings, bloody generals, fanatical ministers, jingoistic journalists, rear echelon patriots, to contemplate this sublime spectacle. Our big shot leaders were in a furor. Once the front line was established again, it was forbidden, under penalty of death, to leave the trench. We actually did a whole special episode on Luis Bartas and his first-hand experiences of the war. You can check that out right here.
All right. That was the Forgotten Front, World War I in Libya, the Great War, week 69. Nice. This was also a pretty good episode. It wasn't one of the super boring ones where I'm like kind of zoning in and out. This one, I was paying attention all the way through. Thank you so. How do I end videos again? I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.